I'm going to talk about some of the newest work that my colleagues and I have been working on for the past 4 or 5 years that mainly come out of this NGO that we started called Advanced Conservation Strategies a couple years ago. And all the work kind of tries to work right at the nexus of biodiversity and people, mainly livelihoods, and how those interact to form incentives. And incentives with respect to the environment. And as you guys probably know, more often than not, the biodiversity and livelihoods tend to interact to make perverse incentives. And so a group of us have been trying to figure out new systems or explore new ideas from other sectors to see if we can come up and align incentives. So that's what I'm going to be talking about. The title's stolen from some editors from Seed magazine that I wrote a little piece on kind of finance and conservation. And this is what I'm going to hopefully cover in the next hour or so. I'll talk really briefly about the status quo in terms of what is environmental conservation, how did we tackle that, the strategies over the past 30 years or so, this whole idea of putting a value on species or a value on carbon or a value on biodiversity and why that's controversial and why that may be a bad idea or maybe a good idea. And then hopefully elucidate some of these 2 brief points by kind of just telling you 3 stories about 3 ideas that we've been working on that take a different approach to biodiversity conservation and trying to link it with livelihoods. These are my collaborators, the 2 people on the left, in particular, Chris Wilcox and Jamie Mandel. They're brighter than they look in this photo, by the way. Very, very smart guys. This is us hiding out in Samoa, working on these ideas. Chris is a quantitative ecologist, trained in the U.S., but now works for the Australian government. And Jamie Mandel is trained as an ecologist, as a bird biologist, actually, at Cornell, but now works for McKinsey and Company, which, if any of you guys know, that's a big career change. McKinsey's probably the leading premier international consulting firm for the private sector. And these are just some both people and funding that have kind of interacted with over the past 5 years or so, kind of developing these ideas. Okay, so if we step back and we look in terms of how we invest money for biodiversity conservation from a global perspective, this figure, which is stolen from a paper by Paul Ferreira, who's an economist, really hits it on the head, I think. So you have these investments over here, and then you have this gradient of not very direct ways, direct being strictly targeting biodiversity conservation, to most direct. And so you have these ideas of support for extractive bioproducts. Those are ideas of going in, setting up a normal logging, non-timber or hunting endeavor. And then you have support for reduced impact, which probably a lot of you guys are familiar with. Let's go into an area and set up sustainable agriculture. Let's set up alternative forest income generation, where we have support for intact use. Let's go on and do a wild honey, shade-grown coffee, ecotourism, et cetera. That's pretty much how we've been doing environmental conservation for the past 30 years or so. And some people call that conservation by distraction, because we're hoping to set up some enterprise that's tied to the land but not explicitly tied to biodiversity in general. And for the most part, I think there's a consensus that these approaches haven't worked as well as we need them to. And thus, over the last decade, we've seen these emergence of these more direct approaches to biodiversity conservation. So we have payment for other environmental services. So that's what we're seeing in terms of emerging carbon markets, emerging water markets, this whole idea of ecosystem services, which still isn't really that direct. I mean, carbon and biodiversity do not correlate at the least. So it's still somewhat of an indirect approach to conservation, but more direct than what we've done previously. And then you have, coming down the line, you have payment for use rights. So we've seen this explode in the U.S. and Australia in terms of land easements. So I buy rights to do certain activities on a land to try to protect that land. And that's been hugely successful over the past decade in the U.S. and Australia. It hasn't been tested yet legally, but it's certainly been a major strategy for biodiversity conservation over the past 10 or 15 years. And the newest idea, down at the very bottom, which is the most direct, at least theoretically, is if you want to protect biodiversity, we should just pay people for it. So we should pay you for sea turtle eggs hitting the beach. We'll pay you for wolf dens. We'll pay you for breeding bird success. And that makes the most sense, at least in theoretically, because you want to whatever you want to protect, you want to pay for that actual item. So that's the least, most direct. And then if we look at, well, where along this gradient, where are the markets, right, in terms of exchange of goods? So as you guys probably know, there's lots and lots of markets, mature markets for this stuff, and there's basically no markets for biodiversity. And we're starting in the middle, we're starting to see these emerging markets for water and emerging markets for carbon. So that gets to the point, what about markets for biodiversity? You know, should we or could we even assign values, economic values, to actual species? And is that a good idea? And that's been being argued about on and on and on for the past 10 years or so, which I'm not going to talk that much about. But I would say that the counterfactual to assigning economic values is kind of business as usual, which is what we've been doing for the past 50-plus years, and that is that humanity seems to be concerned with the welfare of a few species, drive many more to extinction, and ignore the majority. So that's kind of the default action of not thinking about us trying to assign economic values to biodiversity. And then I'll just say there's at least two main approaches in terms of trying to value biological diversity. There's contingent valuation, which is basically an economic methodology. That's a survey-based approach that tries to put a value on non-market resources. And that turns out to be a really tricky thing to do. A lot of economists spend their whole careers trying to do that. They've made a lot of progress, but this is very controversial for many reasons. The much more simpler approach that has more to do with what I'm going to be talking about the rest of the talk is replacement costs, which are less controversial and certainly easier to estimate. And that's just the cost of maintaining whatever you're interested in. So that's the cost of maintaining or restoring, say, a viable population of 500 woodpeckers. So those are two very different approaches that are important to tease apart. So let's go to the U.S. for a bit and look at the value of species. So historically, the U.S. is obviously a state with strong property rights laws, which is important for the rest of the talk. And for a long time now, environmental conservation is long predicated on a moral value and goodwill. Until 1973, all environmental conservation and stewardship rested on American citizens' moral value and goodwill. And then in 1973, we got the Endangered Species Act, which gave that moral value legal heft. And all of a sudden, we had this very powerful, arguably the most powerful environmental legislation in the world to help us stop species from going extinct, which is a good thing. We still, at least legally, ignore economics in terms of valuing species in the United States explicitly. So if we looked at the U.S. Endangered Species Act, on one hand, it's clear it's been a success. So the latest reviews document that at least half of the listed species on the U.S. Endangered Species Act have benefited. But as you can imagine, it also has a lot of problems. And implementation is often inefficient for a number of reasons. But two of the reasons is it already focuses on species that are already distressed, right? We're trying to save species that are already close to extinction that always, or more often than not, results in last-minute, not so efficient, and usually very expensive actions. The other reason is that it often doesn't align stakeholders' interests, and that results in litigation, which makes it even more expensive. And this is just one example. So in 2003, the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Listing Program, which is a sub-program of the Fish and Wildlife, had $9 million to spend on just listing species. In that same year, they faced $8 million in court-related expenses to species that had already been listed. And this is just a nice example. This is a slide that I was talking to the Fish and Wildlife Service about. So the result in that is lots of listing delays, lots of inadequate and last-minute recovery actions, and on top of that, the cost of species recovery more often than not is ignored in terms of the Endangered Species Act. And I would argue all of that is foundational. The foundation of all those problems can somewhat be summed up in this graph, and this is how the Endangered Species Act works in terms of pricing or in terms of the average person's incentive to make decisions, right? So before a species is endangered, it's basically worth a zero amount of money, right, in terms of my everyday. As soon as if salmon are endangered, in terms of my everyday decisions, the salmon are worth a zero amount of money to me until they decline to a certain level, and then they get listed on the Endangered Species Act, and then they're actually worth an infinite amount. And that the government can stop all and any economic activity, no matter how important to society, because the salmon is listed on the Endangered Species Act. This is arguably not a good way to structure a system to try to manage endangered species. And what that results in is this parlance that you see all the time in the western U.S. is shoot, shovel, and shut up. So ranchers and other people that are on the land, and developers for that matter, have an incentive not to have endangered species on their land because they could be stopped by the government in terms of what they're doing or what they're trying to do. And we see this all the time. And we see this with wolves when they got delisted a few years ago. So two problems with that. Mainly we're talking about financial risk. So the Fish and Wildlife Service is bearing all the financial risk for salmon to be listed. It's going to cost them a lot of money if they become on the Endangered Species Act. And then we're talking about incentives, that the incentives don't align in terms of environmental stewardship. So what a group of us did went out and said, okay, well, in the financial world, how do people deal with these problems? Because these problems aren't unique to endangered species, right? We see them all over the place in terms of what we do. So here are some examples of how other systems deal with financial risk. So there's these things called catastrophe bonds. You may or may not heard of them, but insurance companies, big insurance companies, often lack enough money to pay out all the claims if a Category 5 hurricane hits, say like Katrina. So to deal with that risk, they sell bonds to investors that are interested in making money that pay a higher interest rate than a normal bond. That makes sense? And then what happens if the hurricane hits, those investors lose their money on their bond, insurance company collects on that money, and they have enough capital to pay out all the claims from the Category 5 hurricane. So it's basically insurance against catastrophe. If the hurricane doesn't hit, the bondholders, these investors, earn a little bit more money than they would normally, and the insurance company has a cost-effective way to cover their butts if the hurricane hits or not. So those are called catastrophe bonds. very common in the financial arena. Here's another way that the financial sector deals with financial risk. These are called weather derivatives. So, believe it or not, you can go out and bet on the number of days in January that are below, say, freezing, and make money on it. And actually, it's a $9 billion a year industry, believe it or not. And this is all called weather derivatives. And why that evolved in the 90s is because lots of companies, mainly energy companies, business depends on weather events. And so to hedge that risk, they buy weather derivatives. And so instead of buying a stock, they place a bet on a weather, so a number of days in a month below a certain temperature, and if that hits, it triggers a payout, right? So I bet on how many days in January below freezing, and if that happens, I make money. If I don't, I lose money, okay? Well, a couple years ago, some really smart people said, hey, maybe this is a good way to deal with social problems and economic problems, because it's really cost effective and it's like an insurance policy. And so the UN Food World Program, United Nations actually structured one of these deals a couple years ago with respect to rainfall in Ethiopia. It was really clever. So here we have rainfall in Ethiopia, which is directly linked to famine, right? And how does famine relief normally work? Drought hits, crop failure hits, people start dying. The UN then tries to rally money to come in. It's very inefficient. It's very expensive. Instead, you have the UN Food World Program that faces uncertainty and risks due to this rainfall patterns, and they sell a derivative or a bond that's tied directly to the amount of rainfall that starts famine. Okay? And then some investors buy that bond at a discount. So the UN Food World Program says, I'm going to sell you $100 for $90, and if drought doesn't hit, you keep your $100. But if drought does hit, I get your $90. And then I have that $90 to go invest in famine relief prior to famine happening, because it's triggered by the drought and actual rainfall. Pretty clever idea. So that's how people are dealing with financial risk. And then let's move back to the whole incentive idea. A great example of incentives and how they deal with incentives in the finance world is employee stock options. So probably you guys have all heard about stock options. That happens when companies give employees the potential for future ownership of the company in which they're working for, right? Which is pretty smart on the company's perspective, because they're actually hoping hoping that the employees will motivate the underlying asset, which in this case is the company, and improve the success of the company, right? So this is an idea of not really hedging risk, but trying to align incentives, right? So a company pays in the form of ownership to ensure that employees have the business in their best interest. So that's using a bond or a financial instrument to try to align incentives and try to change behavior. So what we've been trying to do is to take these two examples, and those examples that I was just talking about, and apply them to biological diversity at the closest level to the species as we possibly can. And we do that because we want to try to avoid perverse incentives. So how would that work? Well, imagine for a scenario you have these biodiversity bonds. A species is declining, making it a likely candidate to be threatened or endangered. And the government, or even a large NGO for that matter, faces lots of uncertainty and risk, which we all know is going to lead to last-minute responses, inefficiencies, and high cost, right? So what if that institution, the government, or a conservation NGO sells a bond tied directly to the viability of the species? Let's just simplify it. Let's say it's woodpeckers, and we know from the biology of woodpeckers that we need 500 pairs for them to be viable or ecologically interactive. So then investors buy that bond at a discount in exchange for the face value if the trigger point's not reached. Otherwise, investors lose. So that is, if the woodpeckers tank, the government collects on its insurance policy, has a whole bunch of money to invest in woodpecker recovery. If not, investors make money, and the government is just paying out this insurance premium. So how would that look graphically? So on the y-axis, let's say we have number of woodpeckers, or population viability, and then we have time on the x-axis. And here's the trigger that you're going to lose your money. We've decided that based on the ecology of the woodpeckers, let's say this is 600 pairs, and we know that if woodpeckers fall below 500 pairs, they're going to get listed on the Endangered Species Act, which is going to cost the Fish and Wildlife Service lots of money, lots of court battles, etc. No one wants this. So we're going to set the bond above that, right? Which makes sense for a lot of reasons. And so scenario one is the investors buy this bond, woodpeckers do just fine, and investors make a little bit of money, maybe a little bit better than market return. Fish and Wildlife Service had to spend some money, but not as much as they would if it would hit Endangered Species Act, and everyone's happy. Second option is that investors buy the bond, the woodpeckers decline below this trigger point, investors lose their money, the government collects that money, invest in woodpecker conservation, and woodpeckers recover. Everyone's happy except the investors. They made a bad investment. Last scenario, which perhaps is the most interesting one, is that investors buy these woodpecker bonds, and woodpeckers decline, but the investors say, hey, maybe we should spend, we have $1 million locked up in woodpeckers, maybe we should spend $100,000 in buying some woodpecker habitat. They go out and do private conservation, turn the recovery around, and then woodpeckers do fine, and everyone's happy. So this gets at, can we structure these contracts to align incentives so that individuals that have lots of interest locked up in woodpeckers will go out and do private conservation and be environmental stewards. So we went back, when we were kind of developing this, we went back and said, is there a species that we go back and actually take a retroactive view? And it turns out there was, and it's this guy right here, the red cockaded woodpecker, which was listed in 1973 with the actual passing of the Endangered Species Act. It's hard to get a handle on how much money we've spent on the red cockaded woodpecker, but it's definitely a lot. And these are just examples. So a single plan in the southeast U.S. cost $250,000. It's estimated to protect a single active group on public lands about $9,000 a year. We're spending at least $4.4 million per year to keep moving toward this active goal of 500 groups to get them off the Endangered Species Act. So take-home message is very expensive. We went back and said, if we would have issued a biodiversity bond 10 or 20 years ago prior to being listed, how much would it have to cost to at least do the numbers work out? Would it be so expensive that no one would buy these derivatives? And it turns out that's not really the case. So these are just round numbers to give you an idea that at least the costing works out that it's feasible enough to continue to explore. So if there was a 30% chance of listing, how much would the Fish and Wildlife cost in terms of issuing derivatives? It's about $300,000 a year. If there was a 50% chance of the woodpecker listing, it would cost the government about $700,000 a year. So at least theoretically, the numbers work out that you would be saving money by taking this more proactive approach than waiting for the species to get listed on the Endangered Species Act and then trying to do the recovery. So quickly a second type of example of this, which we're calling species swaps. So imagine a scenario. This is a real scenario. Some of you guys might have read about this. This has been in the news a lot. You have a solar company that wants to place a whole bunch of solar installations in the deserts in the Mojave. Bright source energy is just pulled out, and you have an endangered species, and you have those solar companies trying to get permits on public land, and have to apply to the government for permits. And so this is playing out right now, or the past 2 years, in the Southwest, and it's leading to lots and lots of tensions. It's almost certainly going to go to court because the desert tortoise is listed. And so they're arguing back and forth on what's going to be the mitigation ratio. Is the solar company going to have to mitigate 5 tortoises for every 1 tortoise that's impacted? What is that magic number? No one really knows what that magic number is, et cetera, et cetera. So that's the default scenario. Go to court, battle over this magic number. We don't really know what the magic number is. The solar company is screaming that if we don't get our permits, we're going to go out of business because our funding and financing is so dicey. Fish and Wildlife Service and the environmental groups are saying don't build on BLM land because there's desert tortoises there and you can't mitigate for it. So remarkably, the environmentalists are winning this battle, which I'm shocked right now. I think that'll probably change given the direction and the momentum with renewable energy in the U.S. But imagine a different scenario, if this works, where the government and the solar company enter into a contract. Even better, imagine the whole renewable solar industry. There's about a half dozen groups trying to place sites in California. Enter into a contract with the government and or some private party. Let's just say it's the I Love Desert Tortoises group with the government. So that contract is structured as the following. The solar company agrees to pay an annual rate every year based on the number of tortoises on the land at the time the project starts in exchange for the permit. Okay? So let's just say there's 10 tortoises on the land, and they're going to pay a certain amount of money every year for those 10 tortoises. The government says, okay, we'll pay you a floating rate every year based on the number of tortoises on the land every year after the project starts. So from year 2 onward. So what happens if you structure that contract? Well, if tortoises go down, then the solar company pays the government or the NGO money every year because they're not operating responsibly with respect to desert tortoises, and desert tortoises are declining, so that government and private party have money to go out and buy up tortoise land somewhere else, which is a key point. If there's no land to go buy up, then you can't enter into this contract with respect to bulls and tortoises, but let's assume there is. But the other interesting thing is, what if the solar company innovates and comes up with ways to develop the solar without not only not having an impact on bulls and tortoises, but they also improve bolson tortoise habitat, and tortoise numbers go up, then the government or NGO is actually paying the solar company money. So the solar company is actually making money on the deal, which incentivizes them to try to innovate and behave responsibly from a tortoise perspective. It also allows them to go to their shareholders and justify this from an economic standpoint, not just from a PR standpoint. So to kind of sum up briefly, how does this work? What are the take-home messages of this idea is, one, it's an insurance policy for one part of the contract. On the other, it's an incentive for stewardship. It's arguably more cost-effective and feasible in terms of the worst-case scenario, that magic number I was talking about. That's going to be very expensive. And the other important thing is you could write that worst-case scenario into the contract, right? So there's no reason why, if they don't perform, then the default is this real magic number in terms of the solar company screwing up in terms of not protecting the tortoises. So it's different in the sense that the business as usual is usually just a stick approach, where this is a carrot stick approach, which is transferring some risk but also trying to encourage innovation in terms of environmental stewardship. So take-home message on the bonds: one, conservation is more often than not inefficient, and bonds could potentially help shift this to a more proactive approach. And it could potentially also align incentives between users of nature and shareholders, protectors of nature, which is a huge problem in the United States and elsewhere for that matter. So now we're going to completely change. We're going to leave the U.S. where there's all these nice property rights laws and contracts and enforcement, et cetera, and go to more commonplace in the world where we lack any type of property rights law or any type of contractual law, and talk about this idea that we're calling environmental mortgages. So if we go back to this slide, and we were talking about mature markets and no markets and kind of least indirect approaches to conservation versus the most direct, paying people for biodiversity. The other problem with these very direct approaches is that they're payments. They're not jobs. They're not livelihoods, right? This is stuff that people do, jobs, and these are just payments that can be problematic. Probably a lot of you guys have heard about, or maybe haven't heard, conservation programs that come in and make these payments, and there's a transfer of value into a low-income community, and it causes all kinds of problems. And so there's a reason why we've spent a lot of energy trying to develop livelihoods with respect to biodiversity conservation, and we just haven't really figured out a way to do it very well. So at least in an ideal world, what you really want to do is try to link jobs, hopefully low-impact jobs or low-impact livelihoods, with this idea of paying for exactly what you want, in this case, biological diversity. That's what we've been working on. And we've been framing it a little bit in what's called the environmental Kuznets curve, which is this hypothesis that some environmental bad and wealth, there's this inverse humped relationship. So early on, whatever this environmental bad, could be pollution, you name it, deforestation. Early on, you have this increasing impact. We're deforesting, until we reach some income level or wealth level or subsistence level, and then that decreases as we get richer and richer, our life gets better and better, et cetera. So this turns out to be pretty controversial, and some people buy it, some people don't. The jury's really out if this is universal, and two, where do we see this empirically in terms of environmental bads? But there is some empirical evidence for it, and let's just take it from a kind of a theoretical standpoint and a investment standpoint in terms of biological diversity. If I'm a foundation, do I want to invest over here, or do I want to invest it over here in terms of environmental conservation? And if I invest over here, and if this is really happening, I should probably be more careful on what I invest in, because I could be spending money and actually increasing my environmental impact instead of decreasing my environmental impact. So here's some real data that kind of illustrates this. So this is a study out of Peru, and kind of illustrates the role of income in biodiversity investments. So on the x-axis is income as a percentage of average household income in Peru on a forest border. The average income is $700 a year. So $700 is right here at 0, and this is 30% increase, 60% increase, et cetera. This is an economic term that we call income elasticity with respect to deforestation. And basically that is a fancy term for saying what happens to deforestation with respect to my income going up or down. Okay? So if I make more money, do I deforest more at a faster rate or less? And you can see this humped curve. This guy Swanee went and actually interviewed all these households at the deforestation and was able to develop this, collect the empirical data that showed that, at least initially, as income increased, deforestation actually increased, and then at some point it decreased. Okay? So what this tells you is this is your break-even point in terms of improving people's livelihood. If you can get them up around 130% of their income, then actual environmental impact, in this case what we're interested in is deforestation, stops. But any time before that, deforestation is going to increase as you improve their livelihood, which is somewhat challenging, right? In this case, they're clearing forests for agriculture. Whereas if they get enough money, then they actually can improve the productivity on the land that they already have, and they don't have to deforest more land. So this is how we came up with the idea of debt investment, and that maybe if we're investing from a biodiversity conservation standpoint, if we're investing over on this side, can we structure that investment in a way that we don't see increases in environmental conservation? And so we basically landed on the idea of microfinance. So the idea is to blend a microfinance approach with biodiversity performance payments. So why microfinance? Well, a lot of you have probably already heard about microfinance. You probably have heard the term. It's been hugely successful in many parts of the world, mainly Bangladesh and India and Asia, where as a way to improving livelihoods and getting people out of poverty by giving them small amounts of loans, usually on the order of $100. Then they pay back that loan, and then they get another loan, and they pay back that loan. But what it also does is it taps into social capital to lend money. A lot of microfinance initiatives only lend money to women, and that's strategic because women pay it back, and they also spend it on their family. So it's targeted lending. It turns out under the right social conditions, there's high repayment rates. Lots of microfinance initiatives have payback rates of 95 to 99%. And they quickly learn that you can't just lend people money, but you have to give them what the business calls wraparound services. So in addition with that loan, they have these weekly meetings. They teach people how to save. They teach people how to do business plans, et cetera, et cetera. So they basically develop a long-term relationship between the lender and borrower. And that works, no doubt. At least overall it works. So could we combine that approach with the idea of biodiversity performance payments? And what we've came up with is that it turns out microfinance has worked really well in cities, and it hasn't worked so well in rural areas. And if you look out around the world, often in rural communities, the most important asset they have is some environmental asset, be it a fishing ground, be it a rainforest fragment, et cetera. So could they put part of that environmental asset up as collateral in exchange for a reduced interest rate loan? So it turns out the interest rates for these loans, which are pretty expensive to run, are pretty high, often sometimes 100%. So could we provide a different type of loan that's linked to some environmental asset, take the same approach, and align development and biodiversity incentives? So that's basically what we're trying to do, and we tie the amount of credit available to the community by the state of the environmental asset. So if the environmental asset increases, then they have more money available, and if the environmental asset degrades, they have less money available. So how would it work? Imagine a scenario where you scope low-income communities with high-value biodiversity assets. And it could be anything. It could be a peat bog. It could be a rainforest fragment. It could be a sea turtle nesting beach, etc. And then you offer them a low-interest loan with that asset as the collateral. And then that line of credit is tied to the state of that asset. It's independently audited every year. And that line of credit ideally would be embedded in the community as set up as some type of conservation lending trust. And then we'd bring all those wraparound services that come with that loan and develop a long-term relationship with that community. So let's just say it's sea turtle nesting beaches. Every year we go out and we document how many sea turtle hatchlings hit the water. And if that goes up, the community gets more line of credit available to do whatever they want with some discretion. Or if sea turtles go down, they have less money available. So this is a real life example that I'm going to go through kind of how it's worked over the past 10 years, or about 8 years, and then try to shed that new approach to this real life scenario. So this is Papua New Guinea. And this is called the Huon Coast Leatherback Nesting Beach Project. This is paid by, actually us, taxpayers, really. It's paid by the U.S. Western Pacific Fisheries Management Council, which is set up to manage all the U.S. fisheries in Hawaii and in the Pacific, the U.S. fisheries. This is the Huon Coast of Papua New Guinea in Asia. It's one of the largest leatherback nesting sites in the Western Pacific. Leatherbacks are critically endangered, one of the most endangered sea turtle populations in the world. They're declining here at a relatively rapid state, almost certainly due to marine bycatch, so fishing vessels catching turtles on accident. And the project's goal was to pay communities to monitor beaches as opposed to harvesting, which prior to them coming in, there was egg harvesting by local communities. Here's the social context. The nice thing about this project is a friend of mine, Jeff Kinch, spent 10 years with the community. So this is all actually empirical data that we know is going on and not trying to get in, to guess what's going on. So in terms of the people involved, these are Papua New Guinea villages. They can be characterized as subsistence, affluent, and cash poor. Average household income ranges from $46 to $1,000 a year. Very complex socially. Egg harvesting, sea turtle egg harvesting is widely practiced. There's almost no conservation ethic whatsoever when you interview the community. And it's very clear that the community wants to westernize. And there's very limited income opportunities around in that area. Here's the financing cost, context in terms of the U.S. fishery group paying for it. It costs about $40,000 a year. It's not really linked to any performance measure, so it's not very accountable at all. And it actually needs to be appropriated by the U.S. government every budget. So it's on pretty shaky ground. Here are the results of about 5 or 6 years of the program. According to them, there's limited evidence to suggest that there's a trend in the shifts in the population levels of the sea turtles. Although in one community, 40% of the households continue to consume eggs in the community. In terms of the cash flow into the community, there was a single payment of $3,000. And then there's about a half dozen jobs, which is around $15,000. And there's lots and lots of evidence that the project's getting ready to explode, both socially and biologically. In terms of risk, what happens if the funder's objective change in terms of the U.S. paying for this? Because the villagers are basically looking at this as development money now. What happens if the funding dries up? There's lots of evidence of competition, distrust, and jealousy among the groups. That's been fairly well documented. And in fact, some villages right up the beach that aren't included in this program are killing leatherbacks in 2 cases because they want to be included in this program so they can get money in their community. And when we see quotes, when Jeff went out and interviewed these communities, you see these looming quotes such as the donors may have the money, but we own the beach. And we basically don't know if it's having an impact or not. Kind of a typical nightmare, but very common international conservation program. I hate to say it. So imagine a different approach where you took this environmental mortgages or debt approach, and your metric is the number of hatchlings per year that hit the water, period. That turns out to be a relatively easy thing to monitor, actually. And so your incentive is a line of credits based on that, on the number of hatchlings that hit the water every year. We can measure that. We can measure that every year. So does it align the incentives? Well, we could target low-impact communities and provide those additional services, and hopefully target at the sweet spot, which we don't really know what it is, but you could give these loans at the individual level, you could give these loans at the clan level, you could give these loans at the village level, depending on the social political structure of where you're working, to try to avoid social conflict that we see a lot when we move into a community that has high biodiversity and we're working with some groups and other groups get left out. So this is some data from that socioeconomic study that suggests that this might be a good idea, at least to look at, because of this. So Jeff's socioeconomic assessment showed that the average produce that a woman makes in a market is worth $66. But it turns out she spends $33 to get that to the market because there's no roads or there's no boat access to go back and forth to market. So imagine a scenario where a group came in and gave a loan, an infrastructure loan, for improved market access in exchange for sea turtle hatchlings. And then that worked, improved the livelihoods. There's also evidence that ecotourism might be a long-term possibility, and then you could transfer that loan and access to repeat access, and that loan could then, that access to credit could be then moved toward the changing goals of the community in terms of improving their livelihood, being ecotourism. Another reason why funders might be motivated to think about using debt instead of equity in terms of investment is because it moves away from a completely charity-based model to a non-charity model. So basically, funders are using their money more cost-effectively, because maybe we're not going to get 100% return on giving loans to low-income communities tied to biodiversity because they're costly. But the actual loan itself has a high cost because you're bringing all these services in, you have to go out and monitor the sea turtles, et cetera. Those costs probably exceed what you're going to get in terms of repayment, but it's certainly better than a 100% charity model, which is the default now, which are these grants that are often have very little accountability to them. So very quickly, we're going to take sea turtles and we're going to go out to the open ocean, where not only there's not any property rights law, there's no governance either. It's pretty much the most complicated place to try to do conservation. And we're going to talk about biodiversity offsets in 5 minutes or less. So fishing is very important to people. Makes a lot of money, gives a lot of jobs, feeds a lot of people, and it has major environmental impacts, including the accidental catch of seabirds and sea turtles, which is a big issue not only for seabirds and sea turtles, because most of them are endangered, but also a big impact for ecosystems because these guys are the top predators in marine environments. Because of those tensions, we're starting to see lots and lots of fisheries get shut down, which is problematic from a societal standpoint. It's problematic from a economic standpoint. It's also problematic from a political standpoint because lots and lots of political capital is spent on trying to shut down a fishery. If we look at how we manage bycatch, it's not very smart. So this is how they manage seabird bycatch in Australia. You're allowed to catch so many birds, in this case 0.05 birds, for every 1,000 hooks you put in the water. Which doesn't seem such a bad idea, but the problem with it is if you put more hooks in the water, you can catch more seabirds. So if you fish more, you can actually drive a seabird to extinction, right, if you're catching a lot of it. Probably not the best way to manage bycatch. How we do in the U.S. is almost even kind of more bizarre. Each fishery applies for an exemption to the Endangered Species Act. I'm fishery A. I say, I think I'm going to kill 10 sea turtles this year, and then Ethan's another fishery, and he says, I'm going to kill 15. You apply to the government for those permits. The government gives you those permits. No one actually went and looked at all those permits and added them up until last year, and it turned out it was 10,000 for one endangered species. So not a very good way to manage sea turtles on a case-by-case basis. So take the Pacific loggerhead sea turtle, which has fascinating life history. The entire population breeds on the islands in Japan. They hatch. They swim across the Pacific Ocean basin. Half of the juveniles kick off and hang out in Hawaii. The other half go down here to Baja California. They become adults. And they hang out in Hawaii and Baja for 40 years. And then they swim back to the exact same beach that they were hatched on and start breeding and then spend the rest of their life out here in Japan. So that's what you do if you're a sea turtle. If you go to Hawaii, your main chance of getting killed is by the Hawaiian longline fishery and other fisheries, usually fishing for swordfish. If we look at the Hawaiian fishery, it's highly regulated. We have observers on every boat out there. You and I pay for that. It's worth at least $50 million a year. They're doing everything right. So everything that they could possibly, that we know of, to avoid sea turtle bycatch is done by the Hawaiian fleet by law under the Endangered Species Act. Under the Endangered Species Act, if they interact with 17 turtles a year, they don't have to kill them. They're sent home for the year. So 3 years ago, they caught their limit in February. They started fishing in January. They went home for the year and lost all that revenue in swordfish, which sounds like a great thing for sea turtles. But in reality, what happens when they go home, these other fleets, mainly from Panama and Costa Rica, come in and get that swordfish. And these guys are completely unregulated, are doing no bycatch measures. We have no idea how many sea turtles they're catching, but definitely more than 17. And there's no conservation programs going on at all, where, as I mentioned before, these guys are paying for sea turtles over in Papua New Guinea voluntarily. So maybe that's not such a good thing. So if we look at a totally different way to manage the resources, and we borrow from this big treaty called the Convention on Biological Diversity, there's actually a hierarchy for sustainable development that's under the Convention on Biological Diversity, which is avoid. First you avoid, then you mitigate, and then you offset. Okay? From a bycatch standpoint, this avoid meaning let's talk to each other on the radio and try not to catch swordfish where there's sea turtles. And that's actually a possibility. If you look at the data, there's really good swordfish fishermen that catch a ton of swordfish, don't catch any sea turtles. And there's really bad swordfish fishermen that don't catch any swordfish and they catch a ton of sea turtles. So that latent innovation's there. And then you do everything that they're already doing. They're running all the gear changes, the hooks, all the best practices. But if you do both of these, you still catch sea turtles, right? So then you offset. Then maybe you fund these measurable conservation interventions, like the one I just talked about, to try to offset your residual offset, and maybe get credit for that. So if we go back over here to Baja, here we have an unregulated artisanal fishery. There's a group of about 400 fishermen that fish off the coast of Baja. Fishery's only worth about $100,000 a year, and some colleagues of mine have been working down there the past 10 years. They're killing 400 plus turtles a year because it's completely unregulated. But the good news is we know a ton about this area because we've been working there for a long time. We know where the sea turtles are. There's a huge bottom-up environmental education component. There's a sea turtle pageant every year in the community. I mean, these communities really rallied around sea turtles, even though they're catching quite a bit of sea turtles. So what we're suggesting is that we transfer value from the high revenue regulated fishery to fund measurable bycatch reduction programs in an unregulated small scale fishery. And the beautiful thing about this is that the high revenue regulated fisheries killing juvenile Pacific loggerheads, and the unregulated small scale fishery is also killing juvenile loggerheads. So we're not in this complicated situation where we're killing adults and we're trying to replace them with eggs, which is a riskier proposition because that egg has to survive for 40 years before it starts reproducing again. And it potentially, if you could set up the policy framework around it where the Hawaiian longline fishery got credit for it, then you're rewarding good behavior, right? So that 17 number is set every year ecologically, and that number could be 50, that number could be 17, that number could be 0, depending on the biology of the species. But when they reach that number, instead of going home, they stay out and start funding other measurable conservation actions. And I will pretty much stop there. So hopefully I hastily went through 3 ideas in different scenarios that kind of illustrate a different approach, mainly trying to use kind of steal finance mechanisms or economic approaches and apply them to a biological context to try to align human behavior toward environmental stewardship. Thanks.